What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Today let's get started. The tragic life of Austrian Elisabeth. Elisabeth of Austria was one of the most powerful monarchs of the 19th century. Remarkably beautiful, Elisabeth, nicknamed Sisi, defied Austrian court traditions. She went on frequent trips and became a popular figure in both Austria and Hungary. Elisabeth did strange beauty rituals and aggressive exercise routines because she was very concerned about how she looked. Elisabeth's iconoclastic ways resulted in her bizarre death at the hands of an anarchist. Elisabeth married her first cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph. Elisabeth of Austria's mother and aunt decided her future from an early age. Princess Ludovica and Princess Sophie were ambitious, aristocratic sisters from Bavaria's ruling Wittelsbach family. They wanted their children to marry influential men in the ruling class. Princess Ludovica had two daughters, Elisabeth and Helene. Princess Sophie had a son, Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. Elisabeth, Helene, and Franz Joseph were brought together by Sophie. Both women wanted Franz Joseph, then 23 years old, to court and marry Helene, the oldest daughter of Princess Ludovica. But Franz Joseph was more interested in the 15-year-old Elisabeth. He married Elisabeth only 8 months after their first meeting, on April 24, 1854. Her mother-in-law took control of her children and mercilessly taunted Elisabeth. Elisabeth's mother-in-law, Princess Sophie, was domineering and manipulative. Sophie took charge of Elisabeth's children's upbringing. She supervised their day-to-day and didn't allow them much contact with Elisabeth. Sophie was Elisabeth and Franz Joseph's first child's name. Without Elisabeth's input, she was christened at her grandmother's request. In 1857, during a visit to Hungary, 2-year-old Sophie and her infant sister Gisela became ill, and the older child ultimately died from what was probably typhus. Elisabeth's mother-in-law used the incident to further strengthen her control of Gisela's upbringing, which estranged Gisela from her mother. Additionally, Princess Sophie routinely and viciously criticized her daughter-in-law for having only female children. She desired a son and an Austrian throne heir. Elisabeth gave birth to Crown Prince Rudolf eventually. Elisabeth used to sleep with meat on her face. Elisabeth used bizarre beauty techniques because she was obsessed with how she looked. She mostly ate eggs and dairy, and she rarely ate meat. Her regimen included daily workouts with gym equipment as well as equestrian and fencing exercises. Even a slight weight gain brought on days of fasting. Her weight got as low as 96 pounds, which is very thin for a woman who was 5 feet 8 inches. Elisabeth spent nearly 3 hours a day taking care of her exceptionally long hair because she valued it highly. She used creams made from rosewater, whale oil, and wax rather than makeup. She slept with raw meat and crushed strawberries on her face and soaked her nightclothes in vinegar in an attempt to preserve her tiny waist. Elisabeth had a secret staircase installed in one palace so that she could secretly binge in the royal kitchen without anyone's knowledge. Elisabeth's son took his own life. Crown Prince Rudolf, Elisabeth's son, was a progressive thinker with a mother-like outlook. He began his life as a traditional crown prince when he married a member of the Belgian royal family in his early 20s and had a daughter in 1883. However, Rudolf became dissatisfied with marriage and the restrictions imposed by the royal Austrian way of life. He attempted and failed to have his marriage officially annulled. He had numerous affairs and was a heavy drinker. In 1888, Rudolf allegedly took up with a 17-year-old noblewoman named Mary Vetsera. The pair were found dead on January 30, 1889 at the Crown Prince's hunting lodge at Mayerling. Historians are unsure whether Rudolf took his own life because was ordered by Franz Joseph to end the affair, or if he was depressed and unstable. Their cause of death remains murky. The Vatican granted Rudolf a special exemption and deemed him to be mentally unbalanced. He was ultimately allowed to be buried in the Habsburgs' imperial crypt in Vienna. The demise of Rudolf paved the way for World War I. The death of their son put a massive strain on Elisabeth and Franz Joseph's marriage. Elisabeth spent the rest of her life traveling, largely absent from the imperial court. Had Rudolf assumed the throne after his father's abdication, the progressive prince would have likely ended Austria's alliance with Germany as well as Kaiser Wilhelm II. The move would have prevented a full-scale war in Europe from occurring. Franz Ferdinand, Franz Joseph's nephew, eventually succeeded Rudolf as heir apparent to the Austrian throne. Franz Ferdinand's assassination in 1914 set off the events that triggered World War I. Franz Joseph, Elisabeth's husband, may have given her a venereal disease. Franz Joseph had a roving eye for other women and engaged in several affairs during his time as emperor. Scholars believe that Elisabeth contracted a venereal disease from Franz Joseph. It explains Elisabeth's mysterious illnesses, prolonged absences from the Viennese court, and refusal to have any more children. Elisabeth eventually gave birth to another daughter in exchange for a guarantee from her husband that he would crown her Queen of Hungary in June of 1867. She was close friends with King Ludwig of Bavaria, who also led a difficult life. Elisabeth and her cousin Ludwig, the eventual King of Bavaria, were quite close. Both achieved royal prominence early in life. Elisabeth was the Empress of Austria at 17, and Ludwig too became the King of Bavaria at 19. Under pressure to marry, Ludwig proposed to Elisabeth's sister, Sophie Charlotte, in January of 1867. But Ludwig ultimately called off the engagement in October of 1867. Ludwig never became engaged again and was very likely gay. After bankrupting the state of Bavaria with his grandiose castles, Ludwig was deposed by a government-led coup d'état. He died 3 days later on June 13, 1886, after drowning in a Bavarian lake. Elisabeth was deeply distraught over the death of her cousin. It was one of many tragedies that befell her later in life. On the streets of Geneva, an Italian anarchist assassinated Elisabeth. By 1898, the Empress Elisabeth had chosen to travel throughout Europe rather than stay in Vienna for more than a few weeks per year. In September of that year, Elisabeth planned to take a steamboat across Lake Geneva to Montreux. Elisabeth walked the short distance from her hotel along the lake to the boarding area of the ship. Italian anarchist and fanatic Luigi Lucchini stalked Elisabeth and discovered she was staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage. He approached the unprotected Empress, appeared to stumble, and braced himself by leaning on Elisabeth. He stabbed her in the heart and lungs with a wooden handle and an industrial file. Because of Elisabeth's extremely tight corset, however, she didn't feel pain from the wound and successfully made her way to the ship. Elisabeth collapsed and passed away a few minutes after the ship left. Lucchini was immediately taken into custody by the authorities, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. He hanged himself in 1910. Elisabeth would not allow photographs. Beginning at the age of 32, Elisabeth refused to sit for portraits or allow formal photographs, despite her renowned beauty and commitment to maintaining her appearance. She was famous for riding horses or walking around in public with a fan or parasol over her face to keep people from taking pictures of her. Elisabeth was extremely popular in Hungary. Hungary was historically oppressed in the Austria-Hungary Empire. In 1848, after popular uprisings in Hungary threatened Austrian rule, Franz Joseph instituted harsh reprisals against the Hungarian people, which further damaged relations between the two regions. Elisabeth was sympathetic to Hungary, likely encouraged by her possibly romantic relationship with Count Gyula Andrássy, a Hungarian populist leader. Elisabeth persuaded her husband that re-establishing Austria as a European power could be accomplished through improved relations with Hungary and expansion into the Baltic states following Austria's defeat by Prussia in 1867. Franz Joseph and Elisabeth were officially crowned King and Queen of Hungary in 1867. Andrássy was named as the Prime Minister of the Hungarian part of the dual state. The union set off a period of stability and economic prosperity in the region. Elisabeth rose to prominence and is still held in high esteem in Hungary, where she is honored by numerous statues and memorials.